Welcome, everyone, to Building Relationships with Elected Officials, the third in a four-part series of MCN's Intro to Nonprofit Advocacy series. We invite your participation. Feel free to type questions or comments into the chat box. We'll take them as they come, and we'll also set aside some time at the end for Q&A. Slight technical problem there. All good. So just a little bit about the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and public policy at MCN. We are a 2,000 nonprofit member state association, and on the public policy team, we support individual nonprofits and Minnesota's nonprofit sector to be their own voice in public policy process. So this means we provide training on advocacy and lobbying, similar to this. We also serve as a resource to policymakers on nonprofit sector issues, including charitable giving, nonprofit tax exemption, lobbying rights, and election activities. Like we mentioned, this is the third in a four-part series on Introduction to Nonprofit Advocacy. Our next event is a Capitol Lab taking place at the St. Paul Capitol Complex on March 20th. Check the website for more information on that. I'm Renal Ray again, MCN's public policy advocate. I'll be today's host and interject periodically with some questions and comments and maybe some stories. And I'm joined today by...
This is Susie Brown. I'm MCN's public policy director, and I'll provide the main content for today's webinar, and I invite you to feel free to follow up with me after the webinar if you have other questions.
So here's what we can expect for today's webinar, our learning objectives and a bit about the roadmap. So today you can expect to get some information and some things to consider in the purpose and outcomes of building strategic relationships with elected officials. We'll talk a bit about the unique challenges and opportunities of nonprofit relationships with elected officials. Think about understanding the needs, the demands, and constraints of elected officials, and then also learn some ideas and tactics to develop those strategic relationships and overcome some of those constraints. We'll also consider the nuances of long-term organizational relationship management with elected officials and talk about some common pitfalls and other considerations. So do you have any additions that you'd like to add to this list? Or is there anything regarding building relationships with elected officials that you'd like for us to cover? This is your chance to type something into the chat box, any burning questions that you walked into the webinar with, or things you want to make sure are addressed throughout the course of the next hour or so. Now we'll turn it over to Susie Brown.
Good morning, and thank you so much for joining this webinar on building relationships with elected officials. Again, my name is Susie Brown. I'm the Public Policy Director here at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and pleased to be your resource on this topic. Just to get going, we'll talk a little bit about the purpose and the outcomes of building relationships with elected officials. First of all, the purposes. The first one to think about is to be a resource. Nonprofit organizations have incredible information and stories, and the resources that we can offer to elected officials are helpful for them to be able to do their jobs. A second purpose of building relationships with elected officials is to connect to people who have specific leverage in policymaking. We'll talk more about what that means and how to do that later on in the webinar. And finally, a significant purpose of building relationships is to tell the story of your organization and to share the concerns of your constituency. If your organization invests some time and effort into building relationships with elected officials, some of the outcomes that you can expect are as follows. Increased awareness of your organization's role and mission, and we certainly know that all organizations desire and benefit from increased awareness. Also, increased awareness of the needs of your organization's constituency. So not just your organization and what it does, but really what is it that the people that you serve need, and what are their particular what is their particular situation. Additionally, building relationships with elected officials creates opportunities to advance the policy objectives of your mission. So, a little bit more about the purpose. Elected officials really need what we have. Elected officials are regular people who do jobs at the state capitol with some knowledge, but certainly not all the knowledge that you have about the particular work that you do in the community. They benefit from specific information and also from stories. Policymaking is something that comes up through a combination of information and stories. And you have those things, and they are a great resource for electeds. In telling the story of your organization and sharing the concerns of your constituency, this is really a great opportunity to build goodwill among community leaders and build the foundation for advancing policies that align with your mission. Pardon me. If elected officials are not aware of the concerns of your constituency or the story of your organization, why it was founded, what it's trying to solve and achieve in the community, then it's going to be really hard for them to be champions for your organization or to think about why they would want to advance policies that are aligned with your mission. And finally, connecting to people with specific policy leverage. There is a great opportunity to be able to move policies that will help the people you serve and help your organization. And part of what we need to do in building relationships is determine who has the power to get these things done and get to know them. Having a little bit of technical trouble advancing the slides, so bear with me here. Okay, a little bit more about the outcomes. So increased awareness of your organization role and mission. I think we all understand that it's not a benefit to our organization or the people we serve to be the best kept secret in the community. And we often have many ways to get the word out about our good work. But thinking about policymakers and elected officials as part of the audience of people who should be aware of your organization's role and mission is a great way to expand understanding of the work you're doing in the community. Again, increased awareness of the concerns of your organization's constituency. If we think about this as an outcome, we really have a unique opportunity, and I would suggest an obligation, to bring the concerns of our communities to those who have the roles and the power to make change. If we think about policy making and think about what might happen if what we know about the concerns of our constituency, if what we know about what's happening in the community is not understood among policymakers and not considered in their policy decision making, it helps us understand that we really have both an opportunity and an obligation to bring those constituency concerns to legislators so they don't make policy decisions in a vacuum without the important information that we have. And again, on outcomes, this is an opportunity to advance the policy objectives of our mission. Not every organization has thought about what are the policy objectives that would align with our mission work, particularly if you're strictly a direct service organization. We may not be thinking on a daily basis about policy. But as you do your work, if you can imagine that the world could work better for the people your organization and mission are designed to help, then you can find some elected officials who might be interested in thinking about that with you and make some changes happen that will make a difference for your organization and the people that they serve. Building relationships with elected officials provides some unique challenges and opportunities. I'll first start with the one that is the challenge, but not something that we can't overcome. As you all know, I hope, that nonprofit organizations, particularly 501c3 organizations, are by law strictly nonpartisan, and we are not allowed to engage in election-related activities. In some cases, people building relationships with elected officials spend a lot of time doing so through campaigns and through election activities. So this is something that we can't do as 501c3 organizations. But we can overcome that challenge by building relationships in a lot of other substantive ways that can be effective. So we have some real opportunities in building relationships with elected officials.
Susie, there's a question here from Colin. Colin wonders, is a policymaker's visit to a nonprofit without a request for action considered lobbying? And how does that play into being nonpartisan?
Sure, good question, Colin. The definition of lobbying really is about action. So Colin's question is about an interaction between a policymaker and a nonprofit that does not include a request for action. So whether that visit is initiated by the policymaker or by the nonprofit, it is not considered a lobbying visit unless you're talking about a very specific issue with a specific request for action. So I would encourage you all to have lots of visits with policymakers, either in your offices in the community or in their offices at the Capitol, that don't include a request and that really just focus on sharing information and educating policymakers about the importance of the work that you're doing in the community, and none of that would be considered lobbying. If people have specific questions about what constitutes lobbying, I'd like to refer you to a webinar that we have on our website called Yes You Can, which goes over some of the basics of nonprofit lobbying law. Thanks for that question, Colin. And again, please feel free to type the questions in, and we'll interject them into the webinar as it makes sense in the flow. So we have a challenge, not a big one, but a challenge that we are nonpartisan and we don't build relationships with elected officials through elections. But we have some great things that we can offer as opportunities, we can take advantage of as opportunities in building our relationships. One of them is our reputation. Our organizations really are community institutions that tend to have standing, credibility, visibility, and a clear and compelling role in the community. So we often find as nonprofit organizations that if we want to have a community conversation, if we want to invite somebody to our organization or initiate a discussion, that people will be responsive because we have standing and credibility and visibility in the community. So that's a real strength and an opportunity. Another opportunity in building relationships is that we have information. And information is useful to elected officials as they do their jobs. We'll talk further later in the webinar about how to help elected officials do their jobs. But one of the ways to do so is to be a really helpful information source. So that's an opportunity in a way that we can open doors with elected officials. And finally, nonprofit organizations really are about the community. We exist in ways that connect us in unique ways to people. We're connected to people through our service, through the people that support us, through the people that serve on our boards and our staff. People are voters and potential voters, and elected officials are very interested in connecting with people who may be voters. So we have a special people power opportunity to build relationships with elected officials.
I have a question, Susie. So we know that one of the challenges or one of the considerations for nonprofits is that we have to be nonpartisan. But there are also lots of opportunities in terms of engaging with electeds through our reputations that we enjoy, information that we have in the community that surrounds organizations. So I've heard from some people in different organizations that really we should limit our relationship with elected officials because it makes us look too political, and that will discourage donors and other supporters from affiliating with us. How do you overcome a challenge like that?
Sure, thanks. That's a good question, Renal. There is an aspect to all of this work that is perceived by some as political. The reality is elected officials are political beings, and they get into their positions through their political ambition and through building political and partisan, not always partisan, not every office is partisan, but often partisan support. And that these are areas that we don't engage in as nonprofits. But once they're in their jobs really are to serve the community and to be thoughtful, dedicated, smart policymakers. So I think it's really useful for us to think of our relationship with elected officials as community resources and not as part of the political actor part of their world. In some ways, everything is political, but we really need to think of this as we are essential community resources for people who hold positions of power and leverage and authority and may be really essential partners for us in changing the world in ways that we think will benefit our mission. So we need to just stick with our nonpartisanness as we proceed in working across the aisle with members of both parties, not in election years, and just maintain our role as a community resource. Okay, go to the next slide. We thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about the needs, demands, and constraints of elected officials because as with any relationship building, it's helpful to understand something about the people that you're building relationships with. Elected officials are expected to have general knowledge on a wide range of issues. So I'm always very impressed when I meet with legislators or I watch them in committees, and they just seem to know so much about so many things. It really is an expectation of them that they understand a wide range of issues in a general way. They don't need to be highly detailed on every single issue. But it may be that is exactly the reason to open the door and have a relationship starting with an elected official because they really are expected to have some general knowledge about the kind of areas that you have expertise on. Also, each elected official has some areas of personal interest or issue areas in which they're willing to take leadership. It's really helpful if you're building relationships with elected officials to try to figure this out a little bit as you initiate the relationship. There are various ways you can do that. You can look at their websites. You can Google them. You can ask other people who know them. But sometimes there's a personal interest or an issue area that is of interest to them that might be related to your mission or the people you serve, and that can offer a nice entry point into the relationship. It's important to understand that elected officials put their primary relationship building efforts into their own constituency. Elected officials have a very important relationship with their voters, their constituency, and they are all, to some extent, focused on nurturing those relationships. So if you are a constituent of a particular elected official, either yourself, personally, where you live, or where your nonprofit organization is located, you will likely have an easier path as you navigate building a relationship with that person. Elected officials need research, data, and stories, and individuals respond to and make use of this information differently. So a reality in policymaking is that research, data, and stories feed the discussion and influence the outcome of policymaking. That's just a reality. But another reality is that individual legislators take in and make use of this information really differently. So as we talk to different legislators, we'll find that one is very much research-oriented, and they want to know, all the research or all the data. And other people are really moved by personal stories. So it's important to think as you build relationships with elected officials that they will have a different reaction to these kinds of inputs, research, data, and stories. And understanding what makes a particular elected official tick will be helpful as you build your relationship with them. Elected officials also have enormous demands on their time and their intellectual capacity. If you watch them in the legislative session, they're just going from one meeting to the next, from one committee to the next. They're being interrupted during committees and floor sessions, and their time is really not their own, and their intellectual capacity, their brain bandwidth, they're really challenged. They have incredible demands, and they're asked to jump from issue to issue in a split second and to think about things just in an incredibly rapid pace and ongoing way. So it's really important as you think about building relationships with elected officials to understand that the demands are enormous and to try to figure out ways that you can be helpful to them despite this situation. Also, elected officials are often very interested in understanding and being connected to the people and institutions in their community. And this comes back to their interest in putting their primary relationship building efforts into their own constituency. But naturally, they have a particular interest in what's happening in their legislative district. So the extent to which you can help them understand that and understand, for example, if they have a domestic violence shelter in their legislative district, what does that mean and how does that meet the needs? If they have 3 food shelves, if they have no arts programs, these are the kinds of things that they will be very interested in understanding and you can help them with. So we'll move to some ideas and tactics, and please, again, type in some questions if you have them, and we'll sprinkle them in as they make sense with the flow of the webinar.
Susie, there's a question from Barb. Barb asks, what is the best way to engage chairs of committees that are relevant to the organization's mission when they're not located in the legislative district?
Sure, good question, Barb. You know, the value of being in somebody's legislative district is really great because they're naturally interested in you and what you know about their community, but it isn't the extent of the relationships that we can build. So if you think about a committee chair who is not representing the district where your organization is located or where you are a resident, but the committee that they chair is covering the jurisdiction that is relevant to your mission, really one of the things that you probably have to offer them is information. So you can't offer them voters or local information about their district, but you can offer them data, research, a broad context or understanding of the issue area. It might be an opportunity, Barb, to look at your colleague organizations, others that you may work with or with whom you share similar missions, and see if there is a related organization in the district of that member, and maybe you could go together. Maybe that's somebody who's never thought about policy or never thought about building relationships with elected officials, and you could help move that organization along in that regard, and they could help you by opening the door to somebody who's in their district. But even if you don't have somebody who is in the district of the committee chair or somebody that you need to talk with, I think your best approach is to offer them information that they will need to make their best, smartest decisions. Thanks for that question. Okay, ideas and tactics. So this is related to Barb's question. Start with those who represent the community in which your organization is located. So Barbara's raised a question about a committee chair is not where your organization is located, so build a relationship with that committee chair. But don't overlook the person who does represent your district. You never know when they may be in a leadership position. You never know what kind of leverage they have in their caucus. So that's a great starting point to just ease into this work. Call up those people, invite them to your office or offer to come to their office at the Capitol and have a nice conversation about what's happening in your community. Another tactic is to identify others who are interested in the work of your organization, the policies related to your mission, or the conditions of your constituency. So this involves a little more sniffing around. finding out who represents the place where your organization is located is really easy. You can use the Secretary of State's district locator, I think is what it's called, and you just type in the zip code. Finding out who is interested in your work and the substance of your organization's mission is a little bit more sleuth work, but is really great when you can find those people. So you can start asking around. You could certainly ask us at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. We may know who's particularly interested in early childhood or immigration or domestic violence. Or you can ask other people. Often there are coalitions that are carrying out policy efforts related to many, many areas that nonprofits care about. And you could contact those coalitions and ask, who's particularly interested in leadership on the issues that we care about or our mission, and make a short list of people and make a point to build relationships with them. Another idea and tactic, which is not unique to building relationships with elected officials, it's really about all relationships, is to listen. But specifically with elected officials, listen to understand what do they want or need from you, and how is this similar or different from others. One of the things that I think is a pitfall is that we may establish our approach with elected officials by saying, for example, we have lots of data and we're going to give our data to everyone. And you go ahead and do that if that's what you feel is the way to put your best foot forward. But you really need to listen as you're presenting your data or talking about your mission with the legislator to understand actually what they need from you in order to be able to carry out your concerns at the legislature. And if you're presenting your data to somebody and they say, that's nice, that's very interesting, but I really would like to talk to a real person who's experienced homelessness, for example, then you really need to think about building your relationship with them in a way that will help them get what they need in that way. So if you have a person that you can bring in for another legislative visit, that's great. If you don't, maybe you can connect with an organization that serves people who are experiencing homelessness. But looking at these people as human beings who have different needs from each other is the way that we'll be able to build the best, most productive relationship with them. Bringing constituents is also really a great way to build relationships with elected officials. They are, as we've talked about before, the people who elected officials are often most responsive to. And to Barb's question before, it's often a good way to partner with other organizations or to engage the people that you serve in another part of your organization's work that's not related to what they need from your organization, but that may provide an empowering civic engagement experience for them. So, for example, if you run a food shelf and you're thinking about building relationships with somebody who's particularly interested in food security, you may have a person or a family who's been a beneficiary of your services over the years, and they are interested in having a civic engagement type experience. Bring them with you to this meeting with their representative, and it will add a lot of depth and value to the experience. Another key tactic is to build relationships with the staff of elected officials. The staff, now my experience I'm going to describe right here is really related to the Minnesota State Legislature, but my assumption is that it's very applicable across different levels of elected officials in different areas. But the staff are a tremendous resource, greatly helpful, and a really important part of your relationship with elected officials. Please, if you take nothing else from this webinar, please don't discount the important roles of legislative staff. Legislative staff are the people who can get you into a meeting, can help you understand what the legislator is focused on or how they best interpret the information that you provide. Legislative staff are they're just an incredible resource, and building a relationship with them will help ease your relationship into that with the elected official and also help as you're trying to navigate the policy changes that you're interested in over time with that elected official. And part of what we need to do with both the elected official and the staff is to help them do their job. And again, part of that is about listening. Part of that is about being responsive. If they say they need something or if they say they'd like to connect with you on a different way, please be responsive to that. Always be cordial, professional, and helpful. Be open-minded and never burn bridges. Those things sort of go without saying as kind of mature ways to build relationships. But sometimes these relationships can feel complicated. We're not always agreeing on everything. We can feel like our expectations aren't being met, or maybe we are experiencing rescheduling a couple times, so things that feel maybe not respectful, although they don't come from a place of disrespect. They come from a place of the fact that these people are enormously busy and are doing their best to meet with you but have incredible demands. So even if it might feel like, well, we're not disagreeing, they don't see it like we do, they had to reschedule, this doesn't feel all that great in the beginning, certainly what we can contribute to that is to always be cordial, professional, and helpful, and really understand that they have incredible demands and they'd like to work with you, but it may sometimes take a little while to get there. And that leads to the final point: be patient and persistent. Patience as you wait for appointments, as you try to schedule things, maybe as things get rescheduled, or maybe as you're asked to meet with a legislative assistant instead of the legislative themselves, and also persistent. Keep coming back. They'd like to hear from you.
Susie, I've got a question. I know that a lot of organizations and coalitions host Days on the Hill, when particularly they are pushing something that's proactive policy. Is that an effective way to kind of bring constituents and further relationships with people that you know are supportive or kind of neutral on something?
Sure. Days on the Hill, well, we could do a whole webinar on that another time. Days on the Hill have a variety of purposes, and often one of the significant outcomes that people are looking for is visibility on their issue and visibility for those who are engaged in their movement. It is a really good way to have an initial meeting with an elected official, and often there are lots of people planning to go, so there are ways that you can have multiple constituents and multiple organizations meeting together with elected officials. I would suggest that participating in a Day on the Hill could be a really nice way to be introduced to the state capitol, to be introduced to your legislator in a meeting, and to kind of be introduced to the idea of building a relationship with an elected official. I would also suggest that you not end it there, that this is a start and that this is a one-shot kind of attention-grabbing, great opportunity, but that the follow-up from that day is really where you can kind of hunker down and build an ongoing, lasting relationship with that elected official.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide, which is thinking about some of the nuances of long-term organizational relationship management. We really recommend that you establish a year-round relationship while you're avoiding an election-oriented relationship. So if you think about the cyclical work of legislators, they are in office doing the work of their office for part of the year, and they're really focused on elections for the other part of the year, and we're not allowed to be a part of that election activity. But assuming they're an incumbent policymaker, they still hold their office during that election time, and they still have the duties of the office, and we should think about having a year-round ongoing relationship with them, regardless of their election activity, that really is about providing information and stories and a connection to them. So we would want that activity, of course, to not be, about publicly supporting their campaign, but there's no reason you can't have a meeting with them during that time. You can't bring information or resources to them or provide opportunities for them to see your organization in action. You just want to make sure that it is not activity that's related to their attempts to be reelected. Another nuance is to think about what is the relationship that the elected officials would like to have with the people that you serve. So again, you have a unique opportunity as an institution that has a lot of people connected to it. And sometimes the people in elected positions would really like to get to know the people that you serve. These are probably the stories people. They'd really like to get to know them as people who have experiences that might inform their policy making, and also as people who might be possible voters. So you can have a conversation with those elected officials about what kind of connection they might like to have with the people you serve. And you certainly could invite them to your office to meet the people you serve if they wanted to have conversations with people experiencing a particular issue in the community and they thought that that would inform their policy making. You could invite them to a town hall type meeting. And you also may decide that you would like the people you serve to influence the people that are elected officials. So you may decide that you'd like to have some actions or a day at the Capitol yourselves with the people that you serve to bring them to the elected officials and try to influence them. Finally, a nuance of a long-term relationship is to ensure that the relationship, while it is often through an individual person or board member, is with the organization. The reality is we all go on about doing our jobs as individuals, but we really need to make sure that the relationships that are built are understood to be the organization's relationships. And that can be a little hard sometimes and can be something that requires real intention. But the pitfall here is that we don't want to have an individual staff person or board member be fully responsible for building a relationship with elected officials and then have that person leave and take those relationships with them. So really think as a team, as an organization, how are we building relationships that are sustainable and that are lasting and where the elected official understands that relationship to be one that is deeply with the organization, even though it is often through an individual person. A few more things, nuances. Help elected officials understand the benefits that their actions have on your organization and the constituency they serve. Frequently, when we ask elected officials to do something, the thing that they do actually makes a serious difference in the lives or realities of the people we serve or in your organization. If you're asking them for an appropriation of money, if you're asking them to change a law that affects how your organization carries out its business, it's really important that we follow up and make sure that they understand that the action that they took has made a serious difference. And we should thank them for that. That's part of our ongoing relationship building. Also, please consider maintaining the relationships even though it might not seem that you need to. I would suggest particularly with the legislators that represent the communities where you do your work, where you have offices or where you do outreach or where you're interacting with the community. Finally, keep the focus on the relationship's benefit to your organization's long-term mission and the well-being of the constituency that you serve. A few things to consider. I'd like to suggest, first of all, don't be shy. You're both doing your job. Sometimes we find that it's a little bit intimidating or maybe overwhelming to think about asking a powerful elected official for a meeting or to think about why would they want to come and sit in your office and meet somebody that you serve. Don't be shy about that. You're doing your job, which is putting your organization's best foot forward and making sure that people who have power and leverage know what your organization does and why. And they're doing their job. they really need the information that you have. They really need to understand what's happening in the community. So this is a mutually beneficial relationship. Never burn bridges. We're not always going to agree with every legislator on every policy, every strategy, or every tactic. And we may have some moments that feel particularly tense with a legislator or elected official. But please never burn bridges. You never know when that person might be somebody who's got a totally aligned point of view with you on a different issue, or who might be a person in an important position to move a policy that's important to you. We suggest finding a balance between high and realistic expectations. I'm a true believer in high expectations. That's how we get things done. But considering what we talked about before, that these elected officials have enormous constraints, enormous demands, I should say, on both their time and kind of what their brains are expected to process. We really need to manage our expectations. So I would suggest starting with really high expectations for great relationships, and find a way when you're working with people to settle on realistic expectations, something that will work for both you and them. Never support or oppose a candidate for political office. We know that that's the law. This is something that can get a little tricky in our relationships with elected officials, because sometimes they may ask our organizations or us as a part of our role with our organizations to support them, and ask us to be a part of their campaign, or ask us if they can come and take a campaign photo in front of our organization. It isn't their job to understand the limits that we need to live by. It's our job to do so. So if a candidate for political office is asking something of you, you shouldn't assume that they know that we're not allowed to engage in that way. That's up to us. The bottom line is never support or oppose a candidate for political office. We highly recommend avoiding building relationships solely with members of a single political party. You may find in your work and sort of your organization's orientation to the world, your principles, your values, you may find that there's a political party that is more aligned with how your organization sees the world than another political party. That's fairly natural. But we have at the moment, two-party system. In the future, it could be a multi-party system. And the way things get done is by the parties figuring out ways to compromise and get things done together. And very rarely does something get done with just one political party. We recommend really seeking out people from both parties who are interested in the issues that you're working on, even if they may not see them in the same way. They might be educable. If somebody's interested in early childhood education and sees it very differently than you, it's still worth building a relationship with them. And also, for many of our nonprofit organizations, we may have people of different political parties who represent us for our House and Senate seats, and it's really important to build relationships with both. Also, as we can see, particularly in the House in Minnesota, the political majorities change fairly frequently, so you really can't count on any one party being in political power very long, and having relationships with both will help us as the power structures change.
Susie, there's a question clarifying your previous point from Jennifer. She asked, while we are not to support or oppose a candidate for political office, and I think the we is organizationally, can we still individually vote?
Yes, of course, Jennifer. Appreciate that question, because the rules that govern nonprofit political activity don't take away individual rights to vote at all. So we really encourage everyone to vote. And also individuals who work for nonprofits, who are associated with nonprofits as board members, certainly can support and oppose candidates for political office as individuals on their own time. This can become a complicated thing depending on the person's stature in the community and the extent to which that person's community reputation is tied to the organization. And so there are some people who it would make most sense to be fairly quiet about elections in general as individuals, because anything they say in the community might be tied to their organization. But for most people who work for nonprofits, kind of under the public radar, of course, please vote. And also, you shouldn't see any of the rules that govern our institutions as inhibiting our own ability as individuals to support and oppose candidates for office. As big elections come up, we do training on this very topic because it has a lot of nuances. So we invite you to be a part of those as we approach significant fall elections. Okay, always listen and tailor your approach to their needs. This really gets back to the question about, does a particular person, an elected official, respond more to data versus stories, or do they really want to meet you in their office versus in your community? The extent to which you can really hear what they need from you and tailor your approach to their needs is going to be very helpful in building the relationship. Also assume that they are listening carefully to you. Always follow through. This is really, really important for our credibility, and I'd say follow through in a timely way, even if you don't have what they're asking for. It's very common in meetings with elected officials that they'll ask for something, or in the conversation, something will emerge to suggest that you will give them something, information, or usually information. So we don't need to have all the information that they need in every face-to-face visit we're having with them, but our follow-up is an essential way to be seen by them as a credible resource. So even if they ask you a question in a meeting and you don't know the answer in the moment and you say, I'll get that answer to you, if a few days go by and you still haven't found the answer, please follow through with them and say, I'm working on it, or I'm sorry, I'm not able to get this. Can we talk about it from a different angle? But don't just let it go. Never make up answers or give misleading or false information. I guess really what I'd suggest here is to make sure that you understand that when you're meeting with elected officials and building your relationship, if they have a question that you can't answer, tell them that you can't answer it. They're so accustomed to that. They hear that all the time. People say that all the time in testifying. I'm sorry I don't have that answer just now, but I will get back to you. That is much, much, much better than making up an answer that you don't know or giving false information because you feel like you're on the spot and you need to answer right away. You don't, but you need to follow up. And again, I guess this is repetitive. If you say you will get back to them with information, please do so. Finally, and this is just a grown-up suggestion, is to avoid gossip. Sometimes around political campaigns and partisan politics and the happenings at the Capitol, you can hear gossip. It's really important that we don't perpetuate that. Sometimes it's news that's true. Sometimes it's innuendo. But basically, we should look at our relationships with elected officials as a place where we have something very important to offer them as in terms of community information, and that we have important institutions in their community, and that is how we're going to engage with them. And if gossip is happening, which it does, just don't engage.
Susie, there's a comment and a question from Callie, who's working to form a nonprofit that mostly deals with a national issue. She reports that she has great legislators, and I've met with legislators throughout Minnesota in great conversations, but it always comes down to needing to go national. And I don't know where to start.
Great.
Where should she start?
Sure, Callie. Well, the first thing I would suggest for your start is, I don't know what congressional district you live in, but to look up the member of Congress for the district where either you live or where your organization is situated, and call the local district office for that member of Congress and work it from there. You could do that with every member of Congress. We do that at MCN because we're a statewide organization. We meet with all the members of Congress. We do so through the district offices. Their job is to be responsive to the community needs in Minnesota. Now, there's a higher level, well, maybe not higher level, different level policy interaction that happens with the staff in D.C., and some of us have the opportunity to go to D.C. I'm going next week. I'm setting up some meetings with the congressional offices there. If you go to D.C., it's a great opportunity to do that. But we can't always do that, and we don't always need to. So we have another training, which is free. And I think, Renal, we haven't arrived at the date yet, have we? But it will be in June?
Yeah, I think we have a date, and it is in June. And but it's not up on the website yet.
So we'll let you know on our website as that becomes as the details become available. But we did it for the first time last year, and it was a hit, so we're going to do it again. And it's called Working with Congress. And we brought in a panel of congressional staffers, and they talked about how nonprofits can navigate building relationships with members of Congress and how the district offices interact with the D.C. offices to get things done on behalf of Minnesota. So, Callie, I hope you come to that, and others on this call, if you're interested particularly in the nuances of congressional relationships, that'll be a great resource. Okay, a few thoughts about boundaries. You may be personally or socially connected to some of the people you're building relationships with in their capacity as elected officials. One thing is just social media. You may friend or follow elected officials and they you. That may be reciprocal. That could be fine, or it could be a slippery slope. We all probably have a lot of different ways of thinking about how to use social media in our lives. I would just suggest that you think carefully about that, and as you're building relationships, use discretion around who you would like to friend or follow, depending on how you use your social media. Another reality, probably particularly in greater Minnesota, is that you may be real friends, neighbors or relatives with these people. I think Renal has a question about that. Is there anybody on the call who, for example, your best friend from elementary school is now the elected official that you want to build a relationship with? Or are there people out there who have these personal relationships with people who are elected officials? If so, this is actually an interesting thing to navigate, and we would suggest that you try to think about how to compartmentalize your personal relationship and your professional relationship, and try to think about, especially in this idea that you're building relationships on behalf of your organization. So even though in your personal relationships you may have some really terrific connection with people who are electeds, really think about how you can translate that into building an ongoing, lasting relationship for your organization. And also, I'd suggest in all cases you should default to treating these elected officials as professionals and expecting the same from them. You may find that they say, please call me Charlie, and then you can choose if you want to call them Charlie or not. But calling them Senator, whatever, is the default. They have a professional title. You are interacting with them in their professional role, and having that be the default for all of these relationships is really important. A little bit more about boundaries. The Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board has very specific rules about gift giving to elected officials. It's really important that we not be exchanging things for political favors. If you want to know more about the ins and outs of that, you could certainly call us at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits or refer to the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. This is probably particularly an interesting question if you have a personal relationship with elected officials that preceded your organizational relationship.
Susie, does that also apply to kind of executive branch staff and agency staff?
It does. When I talk about elected officials, any of this, building relationships, treating them as professionals, not giving them gifts, it really is something that applies to everyone in in Minnesota anyway, both the legislative and the administrative branch, that includes the governor's office, and the same concepts apply to staff. So you may be thinking, well, I'm not going to give a gift to an elected official when I go in to meet with them, but maybe I'll just bring a bottle of wine for their legislative assistant. No, don't do that either. These things apply really to everyone who's related to these relationships. The next point here is really related to the preceding question. While your organization may not support people in their elections, you may do so in your personal life. Use discretion, follow the law, and never forget that perception rules the day. So you may have lots of things that you want to do in your personal life that are completely allowable, but the extent to which your personal and professional lives are kind of merged in the community perception, you may find that you want to tone down your election-related activity as an individual because the public perception may be that you're doing so on behalf of your organization, and that'll create problems for your organization that I guarantee you're not interested in having. And again, consider all of the boundaries that we've discussed. Consider the same boundaries as applying to legislative staff.
I'll just note that this is our second to last slide, so if you have any last questions, please type them into the chat box.
We've provided a few resources here that I hope you find helpful. On the Minnesota House and Senate websites, you can find information about people, about the elected officials and the staff who work with them. This is where you may be able to find things like what issues they're interested in, what committees they serve on, what bills they've previously worked on that will indicate their interests, who supports them in their staff roles, what legislative districts they represent. You may find the same kinds of things on local government websites. We've picked Maplewood and St. Paul here as examples, but we should all be thinking about building relationships with our local elected officials, and you can look at, for example, your city or your county websites for the same kind of information. There's an interesting resource called Politics in Minnesota, The Directory, that is available in Minnesota. It's a big book for purchase, but it's a great book because the publishers interview all state legislators and provide some narrative about their interests.
The last one is the Minnesota Campaign and Finance Public Disclosure Board. There you can kind of get a list of all of the boundaries that exist in law, and that's also a good resource to find out who represents who, and they also give great advisory opinions if you're curious about whether something butts up against a boundary or not.
Okay, that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar, and we have come to 11 o'clock, so we thank you for your attention for the last hour. We realize that the content and a few questions in between filled up the entire hour. We'd really like to make ourselves available to you for ongoing questions if you have them, either today or in the future. You can either reach myself, Susie Brown, or my colleague, Renal Ray, through our email or our phone numbers at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. And we thank you for your interest in this issue and wish you the best as you think about building strategic relationships with elected officials. Thanks for joining us today.